All right. Welcome to Mondays with Mike, everybody. It is Monday, December the 4th, and we're going to talk about hurricane season, a look back at hurricane season today. So a couple of things going on. First of all, rant time. The college football playoff, didn't really quite work out for the Florida State Seminoles. It's sad because they were undefeated. FSU went undefeated. They won the ACC championship game 13-0, but they did not get invited to the college football playoff because the voters thought that Alabama was better and Texas. So I don't know. So I'm not going to go crazy on it. I mean, Florida State has not looked dominating necessarily, but I think this is the first time you've had a conference champion undefeated not get invited to go to the college football playoffs. It's been going for about a decade now. Now, next season, I do think they're opening it up to like oh gosh, I should have looked this up, either an 8-team or a 12-team. I think 12-team playoff next year. So, but then I guess people will fight over who's number 13, right? Anyway, hey, welcome to Mondays with Mike. You'll see behind me that I have this really snazzy piece of artwork, right? Isn't it cool? This I made with Bing. So, Microsoft has this partnership, or they own a big chunk of OpenAI. And so through this artificial intelligence thing, there's DALL-E, DALL-E, DALL-E. And anyway, you go to bing.com/create, and you could type in anything you want. Like you could say, I want to see a panda bear playing a guitar riding on the back of a dolphin, and you could type it in there and you give it some other parameters, like I want it to be bright colors or animated or whatever you want the theme, and it'll spit out an image. Now it might look really funky, but for this one I said hurricane in the Atlantic Ocean, science themed, dark background, because I wanted to put it behind me in this video. And I didn't want it to be a bright background because it doesn't look good. So this is what it came up with. It actually gave me 4 choices. And the other one was swirling Southern Hemisphere style. So I picked this one. It's pretty cool, isn't it? So you can go check it out. It's bing.com/create. They don't make it easy. I mean, everything always has to be hard. You have to have a login. If you don't have a Microsoft login, then you have to create one, and they make you jump through a few hoops. But it's really cool. You could sit there all day and create this kind of stuff. So anyway, that is not a real hurricane. God forbid. That looks like it'd be a pretty nasty one, but that is the AI-generated hurricane. All right, let's see. So we have completed hurricane season. It ended on last week on November the 30th. Although, as we've talked about a lot of times, the Texas hurricane season effectively ends in the middle of August. So we don't really get threats after about August 15th, and we didn't, of course. It was a very slow season for Texas, no doubt about it. There was one storm that affected us that we'll take a look at. And people before the season, like the newsroom and, various people I talked to would say like, hey, what do you think is going to happen this season? And I said, I think it's going to be a weird season. And I would say it did turn out to be a bit of a weird season. So I want to go ahead and share the screen with you because I've put together a presentation. Took me some time. So, I kind of did it in between my weather hits this morning because fortunately the weather is nice and quiet, which is good. So let me share a screen with you, and I am going to go boom, bam. So here we go. So here I am, and there you are. So let's take a look here. So what I've put together is just sort of a recap of the season. So this is a look at the totals. Okay, so we had 20 total storms. 19 of them got names. One of them did not get a name, and that's because there was a very unusual, it's very strange. Back last January, there was a storm that formed off the east coast of the United States. Looking back at it, the National Hurricane Center analyzed it and decided that it deserved to be a tropical storm. But since it didn't get a name, it's just known as the unnamed storm. I don't really think it had that much of an effect, but they have counted it as a tropical storm. So anyway, 20 total storms this year. 7 of those became hurricanes, and 3 of those became major hurricanes. And the one with the biggest impact there you can see is Idalia. But the lines, these dotted lines you're seeing here all over the maps, are all of the storms and each one of the observation points along the storm. So the vast majority of the storms this year stayed out over the Atlantic Ocean and really didn't bother anybody. We had the one major hurricane landfall in Florida. We had a tropical storm landfall in North Carolina, and we had a tropical storm landfall in deep South Texas. So those are the highlights for that one. All right, so here we go. So the first one to talk about, first one that occurred was Tropical Storm Arlene. Now, Arlene was the first one of the season. It almost formed on the 31st of May, which would have given us another preseason storm, with the season starting on June 1st. We had a preseason storm, I think, each of the last 6 seasons, 6 or 7. I think it was each of the last 6 hurricane seasons we had a preseason storm, something form in April or May, most of the time May. This season, though, that didn't happen, even though Arlene started to spin up a little bit on the 31st of May. It actually was upgraded to a tropical storm on June the 1st. And this one, there was nothing to it. I mean, the picture that you're seeing here on the right side of the screen, this is what it looked like at its most impressive, I guess. And it didn't look all that impressive, but there was definitely this low-level swirl. And, you can kind of see that right there. And it was kind of a neat little thing to look at. But the thing is, it didn't have any kind of consequential effects. It moved off to the south, actually. And it did end up bringing some rain to Florida, sort of indirectly, some rain to Florida. It didn't really have any high winds or anything, but it did bring some rain. So, and it was kind of, in fact, you can even see that here, right here. These are storms firing up that are sort of probably loosely related to the storm. So anyway, that's Arlene. Arlene was pretty uneventful and not all that exciting. So that was from June 1st to June 3rd. Got us off to sort of a busy start, but like I said, not all too interesting. So moving on to the next storm was Brett. Brett was with 1 T. I kept going, it became like a joke. I kept going into the newsroom meetings and I kept saying Brett with 1 T, because it reminded me of Bret Michaels from Poison, right? 1 T, just puts the 1 T in there. You don't need 2. So Tropical Storm Brett was a little bit more substantial. It was larger. It was better organized. This was formed on June the 19th and lasted for 5 days through the 24th. And Tropical Storm Brett moved across the islands of the Caribbean. And so as far as its impact on the area, it was not necessarily a historic storm. It did move basically right over Barbados. It was strengthening to a tropical storm as it moved over Barbados. So it was sort of, it was a tropical depression that was strengthened to a tropical storm. Moved over St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then it passed off to the north of the ABC Islands of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. And they never get hit, by the way, with hurricanes, but it moved to their north, and it kind of brought some gusty winds, but not that big of a deal. So that is Brett. Brett was not that big of a thing, which is good. We like that, right? Okay, what is going on with my thing here? All right. Whoops. All right. So that was Brett. Now, after Brett, we had Cindy. Cindy was in late June. Inconsequential storm. It was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You can see it there. This was an image at its most impressive, not super exciting. It stayed away from the islands of the Caribbean, and that's about it. Let's see, the maximum wind speeds didn't even get that high. Let's see, it made it to 60 miles per hour briefly. 1,004 millibars, that's not very strong at all. It stayed to the north of the islands, and that's about it. So that one was not really too interesting. Now, the next one was kind of interesting, and that's Don. So Hurricane Don was the first hurricane of the season, but it was an unusual hurricane. Well, first of all, it didn't hit anywhere, so that was good. But Don was in the North Atlantic Ocean. Now, sometimes, you talk about the tropics, and a lot of times we'll say tracking the tropics, or we'll use some kind of title like that. But a lot of times it really isn't the tropics. I mean, Don, this was not in the tropics. This was actually pretty far to the north in what you would call the mid latitudes. But sometimes you could still get enough energy coming up into the storm. And I mean, clearly it's a hurricane here. I don't think that they're really going out on a limb too much with this one. Don achieved Category 1 status, I believe. Its maximum wind speed was 75 miles per hour, so it just briefly made it to Category 1 status. Excuse me. And then once it kind of looped around, it ended up moving into the North Atlantic Ocean and dissipating, and it wasn't really a big deal. So that was the first hurricane of the season, Don. After that, we had Tropical Storm Emily, which also was pretty inconsequential. Emily was a tropical storm that formed right there in the Cape Verde area. These are the islands there off of the west coast of Africa. Now, there's always some people that say, like, isn't it Cape Verde? Aren't you saying it wrong? Well, it's Portuguese, so they're not named in Spanish. They're Portuguese, and it's Cabo Verde is how they pronounce it. So you could either say Cabo Verde or Cape Verde. I mean, I've always called it Cape Verde. If you hear somebody say Cape Verde, they're actually wrong. So, and if I'm wrong, tell me, because I don't think I'm wrong, but Cabo Verde is the way it's supposed to be pronounced. So anyway, Tropical Storm Emily formed over there and never really got all that strong. Emily had maximum winds of 60 miles per hour, and it sort of just didn't really, had maximum winds, of, hold on a second, 50 miles per hour. So it really wasn't too interesting of a storm. Now, the next one, Franklin, was more interesting because it became a very powerful storm. And what was interesting about Franklin was you could see the path here. So it formed actually over here in the Atlantic Ocean, moved across as a tropical depression, moved across the islands of the Caribbean, same areas that had Brett. So like the St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Dominica, which it's not Dominica, Dominica, and Barbados. And then it moved into the Caribbean Sea. It moved across the island of Hispaniola, so it brought heavy rain to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Then it really slowed down and it got stuck to the north of Puerto Rico. And as it picked up, finally started moving to the north, it intensified quite a bit, and it ended up hitting Category 4 hurricane strength. This made it the second strongest hurricane of this season. Franklin briefly hit winds of 150 miles per hour. Fortunately, it did not make landfall with winds of 150 miles per hour. The lowest intensity, when you look at the pressure, the lower the pressure, the stronger the storm is, 926 millibars. That is a substantial hurricane, 926. That is a tough hurricane. So, it was a big rainmaker to the island of Hispaniola. Didn't hit anybody with those extreme winds, which was very good. 2 fatalities were reported in the Dominican Republic due to flooding. Unfortunately, that's very sad. Some of these, look, if you have super heavy rain somewhere, especially where you have high terrain, like they have, a lot of people don't realize that island where you have the Dominican Republic on the east side and Haiti on the west side, tallest mountains in the Caribbean. Tallest mountain, 10,000 foot peaks. So people don't realize that. I mean, those mountains are almost 2 miles high there. And when you get the torrential rain falling over that kind of terrain, it really, I'm sure it can get scary quickly with flash flooding. So let's see, the next one was Gert. I had an Aunt Gertrude. And she was a character from what I understand. I mean, I remember her, but she let's just leave it at that. So Tropical Storm Gert was around from August the 19th to September the 4th. It was another storm that didn't have huge effects for most of its life cycle. It ended up skirting by the islands of the North eastern Caribbean Sea, and that was about it. I didn't really have any big impacts. So that's good. All right, after that, we get to the H storm, which was the Texas storm, which was Harold. Now, Harold was the first and only bit of sort of interest and excitement that we had along the Texas coastline for this year. Harold was a very brief storm. It was a tropical depression, tropical wave, moved across the Caribbean Sea, ended up strengthening briefly off to our south. And this was in August, when, you know, it's a time when typically you would see stronger storms. You know, we've had some of our strongest storms that have hit in August. And in this case, this was not one of those super strong storms. It made landfall down around South Padre Island. It was pretty windy. I did an interview with Jason Fraser at Fox Weather. And wait, let's give him a little shout out. So this is him. Wait, did I mess his name up? No. Oh my gosh, I messed his name up. No, I spelled it wrong. Frazer. What did I spell it? Fraser. It's Fraser. I knew it was Fraser. But anyway, Jason is terrific. And so he was down here covering the storm. There he is. Fraser. It's not Fraser. Jason was down here covering the storm, and so I interviewed him while he was down there in South Padre, and it was actually a really funny moment because he was standing in an area where he was protected from the wind. And so I was talking to him, and it was very calm. It was just like he had a raincoat on. It was a very calm situation. And I said, well, gosh, Jason, it looks like you're in there's not that much wind. And he said, well, look at this. And then he stepped back from where he was taking shelter. And it was like blowing them all around. It was hilarious. But anyway, so it was, there was definitely some high winds going on there, but it wasn't anything too terrible. But so it was nice to have Jason here in Texas. Like I said, he's a good guy. And fortunately, this wasn't a huge whopper of a storm, tropical storm Harold. So this one was only in existence for 3 days, October the 21st to the 23rd. Its maximum intensity, 50 miles per hour. So not that big, but it did have some higher gusts. In fact, I think I saw like a 54 mile per hour wind gust or 57 around that area, like Rockport, just south of Rockport, south of Corpus. That's the area that got the most. So again, it did bring, here's the one good thing that Tropical Storm Harold did, is that it ended up bringing very heavy rain to South Texas, which of course, you don't want too much rain at once, but this was an area that had been experiencing a pretty serious drought. And so Harold helped to put a big dent in that, because they had something like a good solid 5 or 6 inches of rain that fell down there north of the Rio Grande River and south of San Antonio, that area. So that was one good thing about Tropical Storm Harold. All right, so now we get to the I storm, right? And the I storms are becoming notorious. It's just a coincidence, really, but we've just had a series of very dangerous, very hazardous I storms. And this is Hurricane Idalia, which briefly became a Category 4 hurricane as it approached Florida. It really looked pretty monstrous there for a while. It weakened slightly before it made landfall. That was the good thing, is that it seemed like it was in the process of weakening as it moved inland. And this hit up around Cedar Key, Florida, on the Big Bend coastal region of Florida, which, by the way, this is an area that doesn't take too many direct hits. Because most of the time the storms will go north into the Panhandle, or they'll just pass by it if they make landfall on the East Coast. But so this was the strongest storm, I think, on record to make landfall there. It was not as bad as it could have been. There were a lot of fears when you have a storm like that moving in, that it could have really been just incredibly devastating. Some of the worst impacts were actually in Georgia. I remember covering it and looking at the radar imagery, and there were parts like around Valdosta, Georgia, they got slammed with really, really heavy rain as the eye, or what was left of it, moved through across North Florida and then across southern Georgia. And what's also interesting is that part of Georgia, well, Georgia doesn't get hit by hurricanes very much to begin with. But it was really unusual to have like the eye of the storm moving over Valdosta, Georgia. It just doesn't happen almost ever. But it did this time. I think it spawned a couple of tornadoes, and obviously it did bring high winds and storm surge. You know, storm surge was one of the big concerns. Fortunately, though, I will say that that part of the Florida coastline is one of the sort of least populated areas, very, very sparsely populated compared to like if you go down to Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota, it's a huge metropolis. If you go down to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, it's, you know, tons of people live there. And even Southwest Florida, where Hurricane Ian hit, has a much bigger population. And then if you go over to like, you know, Pensacola and those spots, but this part of the coastline is sparsely populated, which doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that it's easier for everybody to evacuate because you don't have as many people. So it's not like a Hurricane Rita kind of evacuation. You just don't have that many people. So this one, let's see, 33 Florida counties were placed under a state of emergency. In all, there were, let's see, almost 50 counties that were placed under a state of emergency. The estimated losses were between 2.2 and $5 billion. There were some deaths that were blamed on the storm. So that was, you know, due to, let's see, rip currents. It was due to, you know, people swimming in the water in a dangerous way. So this one was certainly a destructive storm, certainly the most destructive storm of the 2023 season, Idalia. But in the grand scheme of things, when you look at like Ian from last year, not even in the ballpark of the incredible devastation. So this one was an interesting one, definitely one that, you know, taught people some lessons about how bad storms can be inland. Like I said, southern Georgia hit pretty hard, but not as bad as it could have been. So that's good. But I'm telling you, these eye storms, think about the eye storms. I mean, we had Ike. Before Ike, there was Ivan. We had Ian. We had Idalia here. We had Irma was a big one. There's just a lot. There's been a lot recently. Okay, Jose. So we always talk about this, of course. We don't have the great Jose Grignon with us. Well, I mean, he's with us. He's just not working here anymore. And so we always joked around every time, because every 6 years, these storm names repeat. So whenever Jose would come up, whenever there would be a tropical storm or Hurricane Jose, it was always like, Jose never bothers anybody. It's always a storm that ends up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, doesn't do anything. And that was the exact same thing that happened with Tropical Storm Jose this year. I went back in the record, I think earlier this year when I was talking to Jose before he retired, and I think there was only one Jose, because the name's never been retired. But there was only one Jose that affected any area. It was down in the Caribbean, and it was like 20 years ago. The names repeat every 6 years. So it was maybe like 3 Jose's ago or 4 Jose's ago. But the vast majority of Jose's don't bother anybody. So that's good. Katia was another storm that had no impact at all, really. Formed off the west coast of Africa, moved over the Cape Verde Islands, Cabo Verde Islands, ended up staying a relatively weak storm and not really bothering anybody. So the maximum sustained winds on Katia were 60 miles an hour, so it never became a hurricane, and that was it. Okay, the next one was a hurricane, and this one was really interesting. Actually turned out to be the strongest hurricane of the season, and that is Hurricane Lee. Now, oh, wait a minute. Hold on a second. That's not Lee. Hold on a second. Let me, I got to fix something here. I messed something up. Hold on. I'm going to fix it though. I'm going to make good on this. Hold on. Bear with me here. I will pull up a picture of Lee. Let me do this. Sorry, Jason Fraser. You're going to have to go. Thanks for joining us, Jason. This is Hurricane Lee. So Lee actually turned out to be the strongest hurricane of the season. Here it is pictured in the Atlantic Ocean with Margot also off to the east. But Lee moved to the north of the islands of the Caribbean, and it strengthened to Category 5 status briefly. It reached winds of 165 miles per hour before moving up and weakening quite a bit before it hit Bermuda. At the same time as Lee, you had Margot that was off in the eastern part of the Atlantic Ocean, and this was yet another one. You know, they call these fish storms, and I've heard some people get fussed at for calling them fish storms because there are people who say, hey, you know, this is it affects shipping and things like that, and it's a big deal, and it is. I mean, like if you were in a cargo ship or a tanker and you were going to or from the Mediterranean and coming to the east coast of the US, yes, Hurricane Margot would get in your way and make it serious. But as far as its impact on Texas or the United States, nothing at all. So that was Margot in September. Following that was Nigel. I can't talk about Nigel without constantly thinking of Nigel Tufnell from Spinal Tap, which, by the way, they're coming out with a Spinal Tap sequel. I don't know when the release date is on it, but got to see that one. Let's see. When is the release date? I'm hoping that Dave Morales and John Stenval will get me like a hookup, you know, to like say hi to these guys, because it's like one of my favorite movies. Anyway, I don't know when the release date is, but it's coming out. It's coming out. So that's going to be kind of fun. So this is Hurricane Nigel. That was mid-September, 100-mile-per-hour winds. And so that made it a Category 2 briefly. But it was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, once again, a so-called fish storm. So not bothering anybody. Now, this was a weird one. So Ophelia, this was one that we're getting a little bit later in the season now. It's late September. Ophelia was like a cluster of thunderstorms, a disturbance that sat for a couple of days north of the Bahamas, just kind of sat there and festered. And some of the models were showing it strengthening a little bit, and it was just like a nebulous situation. Well, anyway, it drifted to the north, and it, boom, became a tropical storm south of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and it ended up moving inland in North Carolina. It actually brought a lot of wind and rain. It was a big rainmaker there. And so Ophelia, when we look at the stats on Ophelia, which always makes me think of Trading Places too, because remember Ophelia? Anyway. Let's see. Ophelia made landfall near Emerald Island, North Carolina, near Cape Lookout. It had 70-mile-per-hour winds when it made landfall, and brought with it an almost a 4-foot storm surge. Very heavy rain in North Carolina, 7.5 inches of rain in New Jersey, and caused some flash flooding in New York City. And they've unfortunately had a few rounds of that recently. New York City has not had very much snow recently, but they've had a lot of rain. And if memory serves correct, yeah, it was a big to-do because the subways shut down and they were flooded, and it was a big mess. Big mess. So that was from a relatively, I wouldn't call it a surprise system, but it wasn't like one of these well-organized hurricanes that, you know, you're tracking for days and days and days. It kind of just formed out of a cluster of kind of weaker storms and then got organized before it made landfall. So that was Ophelia, another memorable storm of the year. Here's Philippe. Philippe was relatively weak. It moved by the islands of the northeastern Caribbean. It's really nothing they're not used to seeing. So that one wasn't a huge deal, not real historic. We had Tropical Storm Rena, not Rita, but Rena. This one was another so-called fish storm, not really bothering anybody there. And then the last one of the season, or second last one of the season, was Tropical Storm Sean, spelled in the Irish way, S-E-A-N. Sean was another fish storm, didn't really bother anybody. And then finally, we had Hurricane Tammy, with obviously you can see there a very well-defined eye. Tammy made it to the Caribbean and then just brushed by the islands of the Caribbean, right there in the Windward Islands of the Caribbean. almost the same locations that got Philippe, and it, really was not a tremendous historic storm again, because folks who live there are pretty used to getting hit by hurricanes, and if they just get a glancing blow from one, it's not usually a big deal. Of course, these tropical systems are always a hazard. They got some storm surge, they had some winds, but it really wasn't like a historic sort of thing. So this was a look, by the way, at when we had 3 storms that were all going at the same time. Let's see, we had Idalia, we had Lee, and then we had, I think, Jose was forming. So this is where we had 3 systems at the same time. We had 2 hurricanes here, Lee and Idalia, and then we had a tropical depression that was going to become Jose. So anyway, so that's sort of a look back at the 2023 hurricane season. And, according to Fox Weather, their research, and they reported that this was the least damaging hurricane season for the United States, the least damaging hurricane season in a decade, because we had very few really impactful storms other than the wind and the storm surge from Idalia, which turned out to not really be as bad as it could have been. Like I said, damage was between 2 and 5 billion, which is a lot, but by today's standards, that's not, Ian was like at the 150 billion dollars. So that one, and then of course the flooding that took place in New York, New Jersey from Ophelia. And that was about it. So that is a look back at the 2023 hurricane season. It's going to go down as one that was a bit unusual. It was affected by El Nino. I will tell you, sometimes people ask, how did those forecasts work out? The Colorado State forecast. Originally, because of El Nino, when their first forecast came out in April, they were calling for 13 named storms. But when they revised their forecast on June 1st, or maybe it came out the first week of June, whenever they revised their forecast, they did bump the number up to 15 storms. And like I said, there were 20. So later on in the season, they bumped up their values. So what happened really was that the El Nino this season, which usually limits the number of storms forming, didn't really do that this year. And I just suspect that what won out was the water temperature. There were 2 competing things. There was warmer than average water temperatures all across the Atlantic. And then you have this El Nino in the Pacific that tends to almost always limit storm activity. In fact, on average, it cuts the number of storms in half. But it was sort of canceled out, I guess, by the warm water that we had there over the Atlantic. Although I will tell you, we had 7 hurricanes, which is average. And we had 3 major hurricanes, which is average. So we had a ton of named storms, but a lot of them, as you saw, were pretty insignificant and were just there in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So that'll do it. So congratulations to Longhorns fans on getting in on the college football playoff. We'll see how my Seminoles do against the Georgia Bulldogs in the Orange Bowl. Go Texans. Get well soon, Tank Dell. Shout out to my mom and my brother Neil in Florida. And I will see you all next week.